Thank you, Christine, for that introduction. And I'm looking forward to leading this morning's panel as we dive deeper into the critical global discussion on economic security through renewable energies. Responsible and reliable energy is on the minds of decision makers around the world. And it's critical importance, especially with what's happening in Europe and other places around the world. Alberta is known for its world-leading gas and oil sector, but it's also one of the leading sectors in North America when it comes to renewable energies. In fact, we have the best wind and solar resources in Canada. This is attracting unique investment in clean tech, as evidenced by a number of new solar farms being built by Pace Solar out of the UK, by our building of 2 leading carbon and storage facilities, which are up to date today, and another 39 being built, 5 of 9 biofuel projects, and we have wind projects backed from companies like Enbridge and IKEA. Invest Alberta is pleased to host this seminar today. We are a brand new corporation that was created 2 years ago to accelerate the diversion of the Alberta economy and move it forward into new technologies. We have team members both in Alberta and around the world. And since we've been created 2 years ago, our clients have welcomed over $20 billion of new investment in Alberta, and we've created over 10,000 jobs. These investments wouldn't be possible without displays of vision and leadership to grow new opportunities, which is why I'm excited to introduce today's panel. This morning, I have the pleasure of introducing Audrey Robat, CFO, North America for ENGIE, Shannin Metatawabin, CEO of the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association, Ben Parent, Vice President of Power Generation Business for Cummins, and Bridget Schrempf, who is the Associate Director Impact for CDP North America. This panel will bring a number of diverse views from both Europe and North America, and I'm excited to get started with our first question. Renewable energy is a diverse sector. Let's kick off by talking about what some of the most promising developments are in renewable energy in your mind.
Yes, let's get started. I think today onshore wind and solar are a bit our bread and butter. What we are working today, ENGIE as a company, but this is a trend we observe in the whole industry, is offshore wind. Very, very promising, being able to bring gigawatt and terawatt in operation by 2030 and 2 terawatt by 2050. What will be a breakthrough change in this industry will be the floating capabilities, which will allow to bring this new technology in an area where the coast doesn't allow other kind of offshore wind. So definitely in the Pacific and Atlantic region, it will be a very significant add-on. The second technology we are working on is the battery storage, which will be a very good complement to onshore wind and solar to deploy 24/7 energy. So answering the intermittency issue of onshore wind and solar, and also bringing some solution to the grid constraint that brings this intermittency. And the last topic that we are working on is green gases, so both biogas and hydrogen. We have infrastructure today to transport and distribute natural gas. So this is also a good use of our capital to redeploy, reuse this infrastructure with green gas in the future.
Great, thank you very much. Shannin, what's your perspective on this question?
I think what I bring today is an Indigenous lens, and what I firmly believe is Canada's prosperity is firmly linked in Indigenous prosperity. So what I've been doing is trying to ensure that Indigenous people are brought forward and are part of the economy and a part of the prosperity going forward. I am the CEO for the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association. It's a network of Indigenous financial institutions from coast to coast to coast, providing business loans to Métis, Inuit, and First Nations individuals that start businesses. And they've been doing this for 35 years, have processed $3.3 billion to more than 53,000 loans. The problem has always been inclusion. The United Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People speaks highly of this, of needing to include Indigenous people, create their own institutions so that they can participate, plan, and lead themselves. And I'm a big believer in this, but we still have a problem with participating in major projects, let alone renewable energy projects. We do have battery storage companies, solar farms, and are getting part of the clean energy, but we still lack access to capital. We're considered the highest risk capital if financial institution is going to provide a loan to an Indigenous community. And we need to flip the page on that. You're going to bring project certainty if you include an Indigenous community to your projects. Provide them with equity, provide them with a robust impact benefit agreement that takes into account the impact of that project on their traditional territories, and provide them with revenue share. That brings project certainty to every project that's going to be in Canada. Now, with our drive to 2050 to have 1 billion tons of critical minerals, this is going to be such an important element, is to find a way to move past the colonial approach of take. Let's get wealthy and let's not share, to let's start thinking about sharing, because we all have a problem to solve, and that's climate change.
Great, thank you, Ben.
Well, it's a very interesting question that you pose. I think that very incremental step towards decarbonization is to start using hydrogen in a certain percentage in our existing pipelines. So we have varied methods of generating hydrogen. It could be solar, it could be wind, it could be hydro, it could be nuclear. And you take that hydrogen and you use the existing infrastructure of natural gas, and instead of having a gas that has carbon and hydrogen, you just inject hydrogen in there to a certain percentage. So that's something we could do, like not 10 years from now. It's something that we've started doing in Canada. I know the city of Markham here in Ontario is doing it. I know there's discussions in Western Canada to do it as well. And this is very, very exciting because it enables us to remove carbon from the economy immediately. Thank you.
Thank you. Bridget?
Thank you. I think from our perspective, it's incredibly promising to see the development and build out of many of these technologies. But I think it's important to understand that we have much of the technology that we need right now to reach net zero. There's improvements that are needed, particularly in the grid, to be able to deploy this at scale. But what we look at from CDP's perspective, when we work with some of the largest companies in the world, as well as cities, states, and regions and communities that are coming along this transition with us, and we see that there is a gap in uptake, a gap in incentive. So kind of my focus, rather than on the technology, although that is very exciting. I'm maybe not the expert in the technology like these folks in the room as well, but I think my focus is on the incentive, because we need to increase the uptake of this technology with direct finance. We need to get suppliers on board, as well as utilizing this corporate leverage to kind of drive deployment. And we're seeing that with increased uptake of power purchase agreements, and that directly driving further production and deployment. But we also see that we know in our data, CDP collects a lot of data. We're the global disclosure platform for environmental information. And we know that most of emissions is in companies' supply chains. But we also see in our disclosure that from this past year, that less than 1% of companies disclosing to us actually have requirements of their suppliers to utilize renewable energy. So it needs to be, how do we support all of the members of the value chain through this transition? And also, and particularly important here for discussion, is how is that energy transition just and inclusive for all?
Great, thank you. That's incredibly enlightening. And if I look at some instances, what's currently happening, fossil fuel prices are fluctuating in reaction to geopolitical events and stresses on the global supply chains, and we've seen that around the world. So back to you again, Bridget. Can renewable energies offer security at a lower cost?
I think it's a complicated answer, but I think that when we look at the data, so I can pull some examples. So CDP is a partner on an initiative called RE100, which some folks in the room might have heard about. It's a action initiative to get corporates to commit to procuring 100% renewable electricity. And each year we ask them a series of questions to understand, what are their challenges, what are their barriers, what are the successes that they're seeing. And there's one kind of fact in the report to look at. Are you seeing cost savings, or are you seeing, is it more expensive to be procuring renewable energy? And the answer is mixed. It depends on the types, if it's wholesale or direct purchase. But the general trend and overall, we're seeing that the members that are procuring more renewable energy are seeing more cost savings in doing so. The kind of nitty gritty of how you achieve those cost savings or the types of energy that you're procuring, I think is a more complicated answer. And then on the other point of kind of whether this is something that it is a global security issue, and we've seen particularly, with the devastating war in Ukraine, it underlies the truth that this unpredictability that war brings, it shows the inherent risks that our economic system and the vulnerabilities of that system when we're exposed to global supply chain pressures. And I think it's very important, whether that's war and kind of security in that sense, or just kind of our economic security as well. I think it's an important consideration that renewable energy is a key part of the solution for us to be considering there.
Absolutely. Ben?
Well, this is a very interesting topic because if we just go back pre-COVID, our entire economy was based on an equation that the entire planet participates to a certain extent to the global economy, right? It's globalization. COVID hit us, and there was some shutdowns in certain countries and all this, and this brought to light the limitation in our supply chain equation, okay? So when you bring the renewables in the mix, what's interesting is that most countries in the world could generate their own renewables, right? Everyone has access to the sun, right? Depending obviously on the area of the country, but the sun is there. Everyone has access to the wind. So if we are talking about security for countries, by using renewables, you can actually build resiliencies on a country-to-country basis. Now, your next question is about the cost, and I think that could be a panel discussion on its own. Costs have come down in the last 20 to 25 years. That is correct. When a company starts going into the renewables, I think that you need to look at the right energy for your application. And that's the way you get the best cost-benefit ratio.
Great, thank you. Shannin?
I think energy security is important for everybody. We're feeling that more now than ever before. For the Indigenous community, we have 634 First Nations in Canada. We have Inuit communities, we have Métis communities. And they have always sought security in food, in energy, and in life. So to be sustainable fully and wholly. What we need to do is support those communities to obtain that security because of the costs are more attainable right now. But the whole financing, the whole finding the right partners to ensure that we're getting a good product is a very important thing to do. Indigenous communities in Canada need land tenure. They need some surety to the lands that they have more than 300 plus court cases that affirm their rights and title. They feel that they have that leverage. And I think that corporate Canada, the Canadian government, need to recognize that. This is a new day and age. I think that with all those court cases, it sort of affirms that you have the United Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People that asks for consent. I think if you provide communities with equity, with financial tools like something like the infrastructure bank, where they can take debt to do some of these projects. Alberta's got some good examples, and they've been leading in this area. I think other provinces need to step up as well. An equity fund for Indigenous major projects would make a big difference. That would allow them to purchase into ownership positions in projects within their territories. You've seen foreign investment slow down in Canada quite a bit in the last 25, 30 years because of this uncertainty with Indigenous communities. This uncertainty wasn't born out of nowhere. It's Indigenous people wanting to be part of the Canadian economy. And I think that if we provide them with these tools, the support, and the partnership, Indigenous communities are ready to respond. And you're seeing in the news today different major projects across Canada and across all sectors of participating in the economy. We just have to create those connections. Capital is the big one, and stimulating that capital to provide an enabling environment for projects to happen is something that everybody needs to think about. Thank you.
Thanks, Shannin, and thanks for raising the two examples that I'm just going to bring up. One is we worked with KKR in a partnership with Shell for LNG Canada for the First Nations involved to buy 15%. And that was part of the original deal 5 years ago. They've run into some roadblocks on the way, but that deal closed last year. And to us, that is critical. Same happening with the Enbridge deal a couple of weeks ago, right? The Alberta government is actually guaranteeing the loans behind that so that that uncertainty that the First Nations are dealing with is no longer there. And we're highly focused on that because in our mind, our First Nations in Northern Alberta have had good success being part of the success story of the oil sands. And we now want to move that across the province and go for there. And it is disappointing to see that other provinces aren't following up on that. So I echo your call there.
I think it was last week I heard that Hydro One has a requirement for 50% ownership for Indigenous communities now, which is setting a new standard. So these things are happening more and more, and I think it's a good trend.
Absolutely. What would you like to add?
Affordability of energy is of the utmost importance. I am coming from Europe, just moving in the US, so, and still following closely what is happening in Europe and the context of the war in Ukraine and how it drives up the cost of energy. Affordability of the renewable is a kind of relative topic because even if the cost of wind and solar has decreased very, very significantly over the last 10, 15 years, there was still a debate comparing to other energies, to fossil fuel, to nuclear. Today, the complete change of the market has put more emphasis on the benefit of the renewable. And for me, what the value, maybe the hidden value that renewable energy can bring relates to the predictability. And it changes pretty much everything when you think about how B2C customers, CNI customers, government can behave when they have a full predictability of the energy cost. So obviously, having this benefit around predictability of the price is a stronger add-on from renewable energy. Security of supply, ability to disconnect a bit from external provider is a second benefit from renewable energy. Obviously, it doesn't come with no dependency at all within the supply chain. There is a strong push from governments to relocate the supply chain, their industries within their country. Nevertheless, it would take some time to be able to bring the whole supply chain more locally, and this is especially true around rare metals, and so it creates other kind of dependency for the renewable energy business.
Great, thank you. I'm going to come right back to you with the next question, which is how can governments, organization, and industry work better together to encourage more investment into renewables? People may think that I am obsessed by predictability, but as an investor,
the predictability, resilience or sustainability of the framework of the scheme to support and to help the development of renewable is very important. On the financial side, I mean, the financial framework is very important. Be sure that any tariff, tax benefit can be steady over a long period of time, and with no clawback initiative is a no-brainer for an investor and for an energy company like ENGIE. But it is also true on, I would say, more operational or concrete step like permits, for instance, stakeholder management. So all those kind of initiative where the government can ease, promote, and help the companies to on the actual development on the field of the project is very important. The second topic where I see that government can help the development of renewable energy is about the grid development, because we won't be able to develop a renewable energy at the very strong path we would like to if the grid doesn't scale up accordingly. So working with the utilities in charge of the grid, putting the money on the grid upgrade, the grid extension, and the intelligence of grid management is very important too.
Shannin?
So I think the same question was asked at by the government of financial partners globally, and they convened a roundtable and they asked this question: it's like, how can we work together? What is needed? What are the conditions that are required? And so we had a good discussion there. And what I raised is that in order to meet some of the targets that we have in place for Paris, to look at the renewable requirements and the growth that we're going to be seeing over the next decades, we need to work closer together. Government can't do it on their own, so they're asking for the financial sources of capital to understand what they need in order to participate. There's a lot of capital that's going to be required. Now on our side, on the Indigenous side, we need surety to our land tenure. Understand what sort of go, no-go areas we have within our own traditional territories. The Northern Cree in Quebec, they have a great system of class 1, 2, and 3 lands that allows them to plan ahead, plan for that 100 years in the future, which everybody should be doing. We need access to capital. We've always been prevented and we've always had that barrier of capital. So we haven't been able to participate. You're seeing a gradual increase in a number of businesses in Canada that are Indigenous. And you've heard about Clearwater participating in a major fishery industry in Atlantic Canada that was $1 billion. There can be more and more Indigenous business like that throughout Canada if we have access to capital. We have the enabling programs that allows the participation. We're on a trajectory of capacity development where we want to understand business. We want good partners. And we need business support services in all these areas. Those things are accelerators for participation in the economy. If Indigenous people feel that they're part of projects, you have certainty. Project certainty needs to be the mantra. How do we create those conditions? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ben.
Well, I guess my answer would depend if we are in a country that has an interventionist government or a non-interventionist government. And probably somewhere in between is where the entire planet should be, especially because we have a very tight deadline to meet 2050. So if we agree on this, that it's a semi-interventionist government, the first thing that we need to make sure that it happens is social acceptability. Right? My colleague here mentioned that we need to have buy-in of the Indigenous people. Okay? We need to have buy-in to the public, from the public. We need to have buy-in from the corporations. And once we understand what the goal is, 2050, then we will need some sort of intervention to be able to speed up the process. And my colleague from ENGIE mentioned the grid. Absolutely. We need to have a grid that is reliable and that is in a certain state to withstand electrification. The other assets that many countries have are natural gas pipelines or pipelines in general. And if we want to go at a speed of electrifying and at the same time using hydrogen, we kind of need an electrical grid, and we need very strong pipelines as well. So depending who owns these assets, depending where these assets need to go, we need support from the local communities. We need support from the Indigenous community. We need support from the public. So it is social acceptability. These two words are going to be very important to speed up the transition. Thank you.
Outside of social license, is there anything else you would like to add to that?
Well, okay. So many companies have shareholders, right? So you need the buy-in of the shareholders. I would think that today we have a lot of people that when they look at the annual report of a company, they want to see what is this company doing to help meet net zero 2050. So that is something as well. You know, we can't just say that fossil fuels are something of the past, because we're still going to need some. You would need a really long extension cord for an airplane or for a cargo ship, for example. So there's a fuel for each usage out there. So social acceptability, open discussion with all the stakeholders, and also having a good conversation with the various shareholders and stakeholders of organizations. Thanks.
Great. Bridget?
I'm just trying to dissect what everyone's done such a great job, I think, of already talking about what is needed. So I think where I want to focus my answer on is, so you talked about social acceptability. I want to talk a little bit about incentive and demand, and something that we call the ambition loop. So with respect to incentive and demand, we have found in our work and how companies can work together. So in our work with RE100, as well as our work through CDP's supply chain program, we've found that if we can utilize data or utilize companies participating in initiatives to demonstrate that the demand is there, and therefore stakeholders such as government, such as investors, or those that you need buy-in, will take it more seriously, take those regulatory changes that need to happen, and make that happen more quickly. An example with RE100, for instance, we asked the companies, what are your main obstacles? And the top reported obstacles are lack of procurement opportunities, limited or no availability of renewables, and regulatory barriers. Lots of these obstacles were reported mostly in Asia, but we also saw the largest increase in members, so companies joining RE100, in Asia, because they see value in coming together as a group, showing, hey, we do want to be able to do this, and this is what we need for that to happen. And then you have a stronger voice with the policymakers and regulators to make that happen. I think that everyone has touched on kind of what we need, but just some things that we need more engagement about to address kind of these supply and procurement barriers are things like creating a level playing field for renewables. So with respect to subsidies or investment opportunities, promoting direct investment in on-site and off-site projects, and working with utilities and suppliers to improve options for corporate buyers. So that was my example of kind of the supply chain program, and I think that also pulls from the very important point that you made that we at CDP love to hear in terms of needing data, needing tracking, needing to be able to demonstrate to investors how companies, cities, states, regions, public authorities are moving towards what they need to do to transition. And so with the supply chain program, if we have multiple purchasing organizations, and those are companies as well as some government organizations, saying this is what our expectation is, and you're hearing that from multiple places, then you're more you're going to take that more seriously, but you're also hopefully going to be receiving engagement and support from multiple sources to be able to increase that adoption. So just focusing on demonstrating the demand, showing that the incentive is there, because that's what drives the ambition loop. If you can communicate to policymakers that this is important to us and we're ready to do it, we're ready for that level of ambition, then they then increase the ambition as well of the work that they're doing, setting policies and regulatory. And then we have this nice positive feedback loop of getting closer to where we want to be for net zero.
Thank you. I'm going to add a question because we've got a little bit more time than we're going a little faster than we had hoped for. So when I joined Invest Alberta a year ago, energy security was not relevant. Like, it wasn't being discussed. Oil prices were really low, and we were all talking about how we move forward. What should we have learned in the last year as we've gone through this energy security issue, which will continue for the next year, that you want to flag for this audience that we have not talked about this morning?
Sorry, I missed some of that.
As we've gone through the last year, and energy security has gone from being not that high a topic on the list to now being high on the list of things that people want to talk about, and we look at renewable energies, what should we be thinking about as a society that we're not thinking about?
Oof. If anyone has any ideas already on the top.
Maybe I can.
I was going to say grid, but we've already talked about it.
No, but for me that's diversity, and what Ben mentioned previously, gas and electricity. The diversity of our energy mix is a strong takeaway, because the different energy sources can complement themselves, so it increases resilience, because it is also a way to reduce the overall cost of energy, of the energy production, the energy infrastructure, the grid more globally, and limit the dependency to a single technology, a single provider. So for policymakers and for companies, being able to build a diverse energy mix, energy system is the key takeaway for the last year for me.
Okay. What I found is key takeaway is that not any one person has the solution for what we're all in. We need to find ways to work together a little bit better. In the Indigenous community, we have a number of institutions across the country, some in the renewable energy sector, Indigenous Clean Energy Organization, First Nations Major Projects Coalitions, are to name a couple. But there's other ones that focus on economic development, and over the past, during the pandemic, we've been working on a national Indigenous economic strategy that outlines some key calls to prosperity, that outlines what is needed in the Indigenous space to ensure that we are part of the economy. So it's niestrategy.ca. You can find that report, and within that report, we say call to prosperity 83 is Indigenous revenue share. That should be one of them. Prioritize equity partnerships and ownership, 86. So working together, I think, is a key takeaway, and reach out to those Indigenous organizations and support those Indigenous organizations. And don't be afraid to approach somebody like me, somebody like the other leaders that are on those other organizations, to try to find ways to create partnerships, because everybody is more than willing. And we have a responsibility to our future generations to create conditions so that everybody is prosperous in the future. We're in the state right now of having the highest socioeconomic factors impacting our communities, and we want to get out of that situation. Thank you.
Well, who would have known a year ago where we are today? Who would have known that we would go through COVID 3 years ago, right? So I think the question you're asking is, what does society in general do to prepare for the unplanned, right? So most companies have something called a BCP, a business continuity plan. Governments have something called continuity of government plan. Okay, you might have seen this in the movie. It's a big black suitcase, and they guard that suitcase with everything. But those are the plans that are in there in case the unthinkable happens or something outside the equation. Remember earlier I was talking about the normal equation of stability of supply chain and all this, and now we're operating completely outside what was our normality 3 years ago. So when you say, what should we do? Well, I think we should invest a little bit of time and money into planning for emergency management. And in this particular case, in the context of the panel, emergency management is, okay, we are normally getting our power, like in the province of Ontario, 6 out of 10 light bulbs in the studio are powered by nuclear, right? In Quebec, it's probably 9.5 or 9.8 light bulbs are powered by hydro. In Alberta, you have a greater mix. So is there a way for the community to get together and say, how do we build a resilient grid? So I'm back to my grid. How do we facilitate in Canada interprovincial exchange of energy? How do we facilitate international exchange of energy from north to south? And the renewables could play a very important part in our BCP, our Business Continuity Plan, as a nation, as a country, saying by having renewables in every single province and territory, we are actually building resiliency. And that is a conversation we could have, planetary wide, if you want. I'm not sure if I answered your question or if I went way too much out there, but...
No, your point is absolutely valid, and I was part of a discussion 3 weeks ago around the Pacific Northwest, right, where we're having those same discussions with the U.S. states around resiliency, because for us, sometimes in the West, it's easier to go down south rather than to come east, and that's a huge item of conversation. So, great answer. Thank you. Bridget, anything you'd like to add?
I think what I would add, some of the kind of words that are coming up to me, for me to kind of highlight, so planning is one. We have been doing a lot of work. So it's okay. We're making a plan. We're trying to incorporate renewables in that plan. But what is that plan going towards? There's terminology of transition plans for net zero that are becoming very prevalent, and that there is expectation, particularly in the financial community, that companies need to be demonstrating what their transition plans towards net zero is going to be. And that's a transition journey. And what's different, I think, in that if we're thinking long-term, we're thinking towards net zero, needing to be net zero by 2050. Actually, for the power sector, that's net zero by 2040, if you're looking at the net zero standard recently put out by the Science Based Targets Initiative. But what that plan then needs to entail, if we're looking long-term, is it's actually how is this being incorporated into your long-term business planning such that it actually starts to talk about transforming a business, transitioning a business at its fundamental level. And we can't necessarily have that conversation if we're thinking in a 3 to 5 year time frame. We need to be thinking in a long-term time frame to make sure that that plan is resilient in a 2050 future. We're testing against scenarios with a 1.5C, a 2 degree, a 3 degree future, and making sure that we're making sure that our operations as well as our value chains are going to be resilient in those scenarios. So I wanted to bring forward transition planning because that's a big topic. And then something that we haven't yet talked about, and I may be making a stretch, but nature. So making sure that we're always talking about nature positive. So that's net zero, which is kind of reducing emissions, but then it needs to be paired with nature positive. So when we're talking about our trajectory towards net zero, we need to be mitigating the emissions in our value chain, in our own operations in our value chain, but we need to also be focusing on reforestation, how we pull those residual emissions out of the atmosphere, and the first focus really needs to be on what are those things that are going to be nature positive, and incorporating that into our planning. And as I said, maybe a stretch and a little off the topic of this conversation, but I think it's important to pair those two conversations. It's climate, but it's also nature, and they need to work together.
Absolutely correct. We've got about 10 minutes left. Final question. What will the energy consumption of tomorrow look like? Bridget, I'll go back to you.
Well, I think I was going to focus here because as I was talking to my co-panelists earlier, our role at CDP is not necessarily to say, for your industry or for your company or for your city, this is what your grid needs to look like, or these are the technologies that you need to put in place. But we do need to be clear on what is the goal that everyone needs to be moving forward to. And so I mentioned net zero there. If we're going to achieve net zero in the power sector by 2040, that means a 97% emissions reduction with some residual emissions that we need to start pulling out with removal technologies. So we need to, so it's kind of shifting the debate from kind of what's practical. We've had the conversation a couple of years ago about, what are the low-hanging fruits? Often renewable energy was incorporated into that for certain types of companies. Okay, we can start procuring renewable energy. But it's shifting the debate from what's practical and easy to what action is grounded in the latest science. And this is a significant transformation that's going to need to happen in the energy sector. So that's kind of other characteristics of this transition are going to need to be kind of, we're still growing electricity generation. We're not replacing our electricity, I think, at a fast enough rate with renewables. It's still growing. And we need to be looking at this sector's a mix of primary energy sources and our deployment of things like bioenergy, CCS, or BECCS. So again, focusing on where we're headed, setting that long-term goal, and then what in a certain scenario or situation are going to be the technologies or the mixes that are going to get us there.
Great, thank you. Ben?
Well, I don't think it's an easy answer. What does tomorrow look like in terms of energy? I'm going to use my famous phrase that it's the right energy technology for the right application. So I'll give you an image. Today, if we're going on a road trip and we have to stop at a gas station or a truck stop, you probably have a gasoline pump, right, for residential or light commercial application, and you have a diesel pump, right? The diesel pump is there to stay for a while because it's for very demanding applications. But from a transition perspective, we could very well go and purchase electric cars. So the energy tomorrow is, when you pull in a truck stop, you have a gasoline pump, you have a diesel pump, and you have kind of an electric pistol to plug your car, right? But there's also room for hydrogen in those places, because if you have a light commercial or a medium duty application, you could use a traditional internal combustion engine powered by hydrogen. And for about 500 kilometers of autonomy, it takes about 15 minutes to refuel the tank in a hydrogen platform. So it's faster than electric. It's not as fast as the old gasoline or the old diesel, but 15 minutes is something that is palatable for the way the economy is based today. So how do we generate the hydrogen? Well, you have a nice hydrolyzer, and it could be connected to solar panels, could be connected to windmills, could be connected to the grid if the grid is using hydro, because these three, solar, wind, and hydro are all qualify for green hydrogen, right? Then if I may create a little bit of a debate 6 minutes in, there's also something called pink hydrogen or purple hydrogen, right? That's hydrogen generated by nuclear reactors. So for the countries today that have social acceptability of nuclear power, those huge reactors work in what we call baseload mode. So if you have not enough demand in the middle of the night, you may just take the excess electricity, generate hydrogen. That hydrogen is easily storable in a tank, just like you have a barbecue. I'm oversimplifying, but you have a barbecue tank under your barbecue, okay? So we got a nuclear reactor, we have an hydrolyzer, we generate hydrogen, and we store the hydrogen in your barbecue tank. But when we need that hydrogen, then we can release it in our other national assets or provincial assets. This is the pipeline, right? So the question you asked is extremely interesting. There's no short answer, because I'm going to say it depends on the sector and the segment of the industry. So, but we need to explain that to all the stakeholders, okay, that we need to transition by 2040 from a power generation perspective if we want to meet 2050. But in order to get there, we're going to need some blend. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannin.
No doubt the demand is going to increase. The technology might not be there, and the current processes might need to be improved. But the way that I like to look at it is, you like to see yourself reflected in the systems of today. And for me, I've always advocated for Indigenous to be included into the systems. In 2019, I presented to the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They have 200 plus committees that plan, and we're talking about planning. They've got renewable energy planning, but there's not one committee that is dedicated to Indigenous issues. Now, in the world, there's 500 million Indigenous people. Lots of countries have Indigenous people that are there. We need to be included within the process. We have a worldview of balance, of taking into account environment, social, and business. We need to include all these organizations. Each one of you have an opportunity to create a board position for a person of the global majority. Provide doorways for them to enter your corporation, because we don't see ourselves reflected in Canada, in the global economy. And we need to do better there, because that there will bring in new thinking, new processes, new ways to approach solving the problems of today. Miigwech.
Thank you, Bridget.
I pretty much agree, or I very much agree with Bridget on energy efficiency, because it's not because we greenify through renewable energy or energy consumption that we should not work on energy efficiency measure, and especially because we do not have 30 years to make it happen. The next upcoming 10 years are crucial. And energy efficiency is, for me, has a shortened payback if we want to stay on track of the 1.5 degree trajectory. I also agree with Ben regarding the diversity of usage. There is no one size fits all, and we should make the best usage of the energy depending on the energy intensity and the way to consume this energy. And it will depend country by country too, because it depends also where you come from, right? Maybe what I would add to the discussion is I think we will have a much more decentralized way to consume and produce energy. So having the ability to produce locally, to store locally, and I think the most important for me is to be able to use local resources. So it might be geothermal, it might be biomass, it might be waste to energy. There are a lot of different local resources that both residential customer, but for sure commercial and industrial customers will be working on. And in terms of behavior, that's a significant change.
Great, thank you, Audrey. Appreciate that. Sorry for the mix-up on the names there. And I want to thank this panel for getting us thinking a little bit more about these areas. I think we've just scratched the surface today on being able to look at some of these areas, but we need to seriously look at renewables and how we get security and renewables into the mix as a discussion, because we're not often there these days. So thank you for your important and thoughtful discussion that each of you contributed to. Truly appreciate that. Thanks to the Toronto Global Forum for giving Invest Alberta a chance to sponsor this event, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of the forum, and thank you for being here today.